Okay, tonight we have Ed Anderson of the Astronomical, let me get this right, ASLI, Astronomical Society of Long Island, right? Ed, I had your history up, but could you just maybe give us a short bio
Sure.
before you begin?
Sure. So this is Ed Anderson. I am, as said, with the Astronomical Society of Long Island and with the Custer Institute and Observatory on Long Island, which is probably the longest operating observatory at least in the lower part of New York. I've been involved in astronomy now for a mere 7.5 years. But in that time, I've become quite obsessed. Today, I have 5 telescopes. I think I've had 9 total over that 7 years. I've worked outreach sessions. I've done series of presentations for Custer and for ASLI. I've done a lot of outreach. The presentation that I'll be using tonight was actually originally done for the Custer Observatory for one of their outreach programs. And you should, by the way, you should all keep your hands on your wallets because I'm a retired salesman. All right, so if everybody's ready, I will kick this off. Am I clear to go?
Yep, let her rip.
Okay. All right, and again, everyone, sorry for being late to the show. We had a little mix-up on the. Why is this screen up? What are you seeing? Are you seeing slides? Or are you seeing my my file screen?
We're seeing nothing. We're seeing the Zoom people.
Okay, hold on. Let me get rid of this. Hang on. Where's the Zoom? Get rid of this. Why can't I get this back up on the screen? And then do this. And now let's share the screen. Host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oops.
That's all right. We seem to have a lot of that tonight.
Let's try this. All right. Okay, I think we worked out all the kinks.
Okay, let's get rid of that. And let's see if I can do this. And share the screen. This was just a challenge to see if I could actually overcome.
So it was a test.
Yeah, it was a test. All right, let me know when you see my PowerPoint.
Yay, we can see it.
There it is.
All right, good. Let's see if I can get into. All right, are you seeing just the main presentation, or are you seeing the slides down the side as well?
I see the slides on the side.
All right. Let's see. One last thing here, and then I think we'll get this going. All right, looks like we may have to do it this way because I can't see. Ah, there it is. That should be right. How are we doing? Are we looking okay? You see my understanding
correct for a moment.
Yeah, now we see the slides on the side again.
Why is it doing this?
It looked like a double click or something instead of a single, or guessing. I don't know, computers.
All right, I'm gonna stop sharing for a second. Why are we having this problem? I do these kind of things all the time. All right, share the screen. There we go. Share. What are you seeing?
Just your presentation.
Oh, good, good. That's what you were supposed to be saying. All right. All right. Thank you, everyone, for your patience and for the fumbling start here. What we're going to do, this presentation was written as part of a series of presentations primarily targeted towards beginners. to help them understand what it's involved in terms of getting your first telescope, what is the equipment you're going to need, and understanding all the terms and such that go with it. If anyone has a question, please do not hesitate to interrupt me. I don't have a problem with that at all. If I say something you don't understand, or if you have some brilliant thing to add to what I've said, please be my guest. So we're going to talk about understanding eyepieces. So here's, you see the slide that says newbie, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure this is working. All right, so the newbie comes up to you, the experienced person, the wizard, the member of the club, and he says, I just bought my first telescope. What eyepiece should I buy? Well, you want something wide. Nagler's the best, but you might be able to get that Earphiles, depending on how fast your scope is. Earphiles don't do as well, blah, 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 Greek, blah, blah, other languages. What the devil is this guy talking about? Sorry, I asked for help. And there's the poor newbie who's trying to understand what you're telling him. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through some of the elements of eyepieces. I've actually got an article that I wrote on this topic. So if anybody's interested, I can send you the link to that afterwards. We're going to talk about sizes, focal lengths, and everything else that is laid out here. We're going to be talking about optical eyepieces. I have not incorporated things like night vision eyepieces. I felt that was a little bit outside the scope of the presentation. So eyepieces. Eyepieces come in 3 sizes. The 0.965, for those of you who have been into this hobby for a long time, these are pretty much obsolete. These were the old eyepieces. Today, the scopes are pretty much standardized on 1.25 inch and 2 inch size. Can you see my pointer, by the way? Okay,
Yes.
good.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So pretty much every modern scope out there will take 1.25 inch eyepieces. So you buy these, they'll fit pretty much anything. If you're out in the used market and you're looking at a scope that uses 0.965 inch eyepieces, my recommendation is don't buy it or plan to change the focuser. And we'll get more into that later. So the 1.25 inch is pretty much the standard. 2 inch eyepieces, you have to have a 2 inch focuser to use them. A lot of the larger scopes have them, but many of the smaller scopes do not. So if you're out looking for eyepieces, make sure you know what size eyepieces your focuser will take. Now, focal length of the scope divided by focal length of the eyepiece equals the power or the magnification. This is one of the things that mystified me when I first started, because I thought, oh, you go out and you buy a 20 power eyepiece. Well, apparently not. So I've used 2 scopes here, 2 different focal lengths. They just happen to be 3 times the focal length. So a 38 millimeter eyepiece in a 1200 millimeter focal length scope, divided by focal length eyepiece equals the magnification. So we see that a 38 millimeter eyepiece in this scope gives me 31 power. A 38 millimeter eyepiece in this scope gives me 10.5 power. All right, so this is just one of those very simple calculations that anybody who's looking at eyepieces needs to understand. This can be especially important when you have multiple telescopes and you plan to share eyepieces around them. Another element of the eyepiece is when you're looking at eyepieces, you're going to see specifications about eye relief. Eye relief is that dimension. You see you have an eye here. Here's the eyepiece. This distance, number 3, is the eye relief. And what this refers to is how close does your eye need to be to the top of that eyepiece in order for you to see the full field of view. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. Once you get less than, say, let's arbitrarily say 10 millimeters from this thing, it starts to become uncomfortable because it feels like you're putting your eye right on the lens. If you're a glasses wearer, so your glasses are going to be sitting on top of the eyepiece, your eye is going to be further back, you probably need at least I'll lean on any of the eyeglass wearers here who want to kick in, but I'm going to say you probably want to have at least 16 to 18 millimeters of eye relief or more, depending on your glasses. And so when you're looking at eyepieces, you want to take a look at the eye relief numbers. And again, if you're a glasses wearer, this is something you must be aware of, because if you've got less than, I've put 17 millimeters here, all depends on the individual, you're not going to be able to see the full field of view if you're wearing your glasses. Now, an important point here, I'm an eyeglasses wearer. I have, progressive lenses, I've got astigmatism, yet when I am observing in my telescope, I take my glasses off. The reason being is that mostly I'm concerned about the focus, and that's what the focuser does. I don't need my glasses to be able to focus like I would if I was reading.
Yes, excuse me, Ed, I always tell people, new ones come up, if they're having glasses, I said, take your glasses off. You'll be able to see the full field of view, and there's enough focus travel to make up for however bad your eyes are.
Exactly right. The one thing I will point out, and I mentioned that I have astigmatism. When I'm looking through a very low power eyepiece, particularly my low power wide view eyepieces, that astigmatism kicks in and it distorts the nature of the images. Stars look like they have little spikes on them. I'll talk a little bit later about that, but from a focus point of view, you do not need your glasses to focus these eyepieces for most people. Here's more on eye relief. So here's an example. Here's an eyepiece with 20 millimeter eye relief. You see the position of the eye, 15, 10, and 5 millimeter. If you've got to hold your eye within 5 millimeters of the eyepiece, it can be quite uncomfortable. In addition, in cold weather, the moisture coming off your eye can actually lead to fogging the lens on the eyepiece. I've actually had that happen. So the numbers shown represent different amounts of eye relief. We'll talk more about this. What we've used here, is just a generic example of an eyepiece, but when we start talking about different eyepiece designs, this will come more into play. These images would map well to Plossel's and Kellner's, where the shorter, if these were the eyepiece focal lengths rather than the eye relief, then we would see that as the focal length of the eyepiece gets shorter, you have to hold your eye closer. So other designs have been created where the eye relief does not decrease as much as you go into shorter and shorter focal length eyepieces. Now, this is one that, again, I built this presentation out of my own mystification about all these terms. Apparent field of view is a specification provided by the eyepiece manufacturer. If we take the apparent field of view and we divide it by the magnification produced by that eyepiece, we get an approximate true field of view of what we're looking at in the sky. So for example, telescope 2000 millimeter focal length. I got a 15 millimeter eyepiece on there, 2000 divided by, so I'm looking with about 133 power. Now, if I've got a 15 millimeter eyepiece with a 50 millimeter apparent field of view, such as this one, 50 divided by 100, I'm going to be looking at about 0.38 degrees of the sky, about 3/4 of the diameter of the full moon. If I have an eyepiece that is 15 millimeters in focal length, but has an 82 degree apparent field of view, I'm going to be looking at a 0.61 degree field of view, which is greater than the full moon. Now, when people are looking to buy eyepieces, looking to understand eyepieces, this apparent field of view specification becomes very important. You look at two eyepieces, one of them is 15 millimeter, and it's a 15 millimeter Plossel, and geez, that thing's $30. And I go for an Explore Scientific ES82 15 millimeter, and I'm paying $200 for it. Part of what I'm paying for is the apparent field of view. There are other characteristics of the eyepiece that contribute to that cost, but the apparent field of view is what I'm focused on at the moment. In the olden days, let's say 30, 40 years ago, a 50-degree apparent field of view eyepiece, typical of a Plössl, would have considered pretty wide view, pretty reasonable. Today, these are considered fairly narrow. Something over 60 degrees would be more, moving into the wider field of view. An 82-degree apparent field of view are quite common. My eyepiece set is almost all 82-degree. You can get eyepieces with apparent field of view of 120 degrees. What you end up with is this, what's referred to as this immersive feeling. You get a look of like looking out into a much wider part of space. Now here's a demonstration. For those who don't recognize it, this is the Pleiades. This is an open star cluster. And if I was looking at it, these are all shown at the same magnification. If I was looking at this with a 50-degree apparent field of view eyepiece, this is approximately what I would see of the Pleiades. A 68-degree, I see the stars and I see more of the surrounding, which gives me greater context. With an 82-degree eyepiece, I see even more of the surrounding area for more context. So I see the Pleiades more set into its surrounding. Notice that the magnification on each one of these images is exactly the same. So all we're doing is we're opening this up. Comments, questions so far? No, okay. Here's another way to look at it. Again, this would be, this looks like the Orion Nebula. And here's what it would look like in a 68-degree, and here's what we would see in a 120 degree series eyepiece. Planets are small relative to the things that the other things that we look at in the sky. So if you're a planet hound and planets are what your main interest is, we have less of a concern about the apparent field of view of the eyepiece. What's shown here is a 20mm 40-degree eyepiece and the field of view that it would present of Mars. And Mars, takes up a relatively small part of the image, and so I don't nearly need a wide image. If I'm using a tracking scope, this is great. If I am using a manual scope, a scope that is tracked manually, a benefit that we get from having a wider field of view has nothing to do with actually looking at the planet. It has to do with what I refer to as drift time. Because as we're observing this object, we're going to have to continuously move the scope in order to keep the object in the field of view. And so I might be observing this on a manually tracking scope. I might put Mars over here in the beginning of the observation, and over a period of 30 seconds or so, it's going to drift across the field of view. And then I have to move the scope again. If I had an 82-degree apparent field of view eyepiece, that field of view would be wider and I would get more drift time. Okay, magnification would be exactly the same. Questions, comments? Nope, we're doing good. So here it is with an eyepiece that has a 40-degree apparent field of view. Here it is with an eyepiece with an 82-degree apparent field of view. The image of Mars hasn't changed. I just see it in a greater context, and I have more drift time as it passes through the field. Now, one of the characteristics that we report on with telescopes is their focal ratio. The focal ratio is the focal length of the scope divided by the aperture of the scope. What this refers to now, okay, so we got focal length divided by aperture. Essentially what will happen is the higher the focal ratio, the higher the number, It is easier for an eyepiece to have a well-corrected image across the entire field of view. With a lower focal ratio scope, it is more difficult for the eyepiece to have a well-corrected image across the field of view. The reason being is that if I have, this is my aperture, this is my focal length. The shorter the focal length, the steeper these outer rays of light that are coming into the eyepiece will be. Now that eyepiece has to take that steep ray of light and turn it to create an image for my eye where these are much more parallelized. All right. So the longer that focal the focal length, the higher the focal ratio numerically, the easier it is. So if you talk to a experienced person about eyepieces, one of the questions that may be asked is, what's the focal ratio of your scope? If it's 10, your focal ratio is 10, 12, 15, even fairly inexpensive eyepieces that are not terribly well corrected will give you a pretty good image all the way across the field of view. If you're talking about something that's focal ratio f4, f5, f6, that's a much steeper angle for those outer rays that are coming through. And as a result, you're going to want an eyepiece that is better corrected. And these tend to be the more expensive eyepieces. This is something that, while I can explain it here, is really better demonstrated with a scope, with some eyepieces. Most beginners are not even going to realize that the outer areas of their image are distorted. Maybe they don't have a really good flat image all the way across. Those of us who have been doing this for a few years, we take notice of it. Some people are very much bothered by this, and some people are not bothered quite so much. Coatings. Coatings are a development over probably the last 60, 70 years that are deposited on the eyepiece glass to enhance light transmission or to control internal reflections. They improve the amount and quality of the light sent to the eye. The following terms are not standardized in the industry, but these are general meanings. And if you look at an eyepiece and you're looking at the description of the eyepiece that the manufacturers put out there, you're reading it on Amazon, you're reading it on Astronomics, any other place, you'll see things that like say coated. A coated will typically refer to you have a single layer anti-reflective coating on one or more of the lens surfaces. Fully coated, at least one thin layer of anti-reflective coating on both sides of the lens system. Now, some lens systems have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 elements to them. This would suggest that at least the first element, outer edge, and the last element, outer surface, have a coating. Multi-coated would indicate that multiple layers of coatings have been put on the surfaces. Typically, a multi-coated would be considered better than fully coated or coated. And fully multi-coated typically would mean that all lens surfaces have multiple coatings to help control internal reflections and to enhance light transmission. Typically, you only see coated or fully coated in the very, very low-end eyepieces. Sometimes the eyepieces that are included with a beginner telescope, an inexpensive beginner telescope, may be coated or fully coated. I haven't really seen anything out there that isn't coated at least a little bit. That may not have been true, again, 30, 40, 50 years ago when these were fairly new. But today, pretty much every eyepiece I've seen is at least fully coated. Many of them are multi-coated, and certainly the higher end ones are fully multi-coated. But again, these terms are not standardized in the industry, so this is sort of, half-truths in marketing. Eyepiece designs. An eyepiece is not an eyepiece is not an eyepiece. These eyepieces have developed over generations, centuries. And the number of elements in the eyepiece, how they're configured, how they're shaped, varies widely. The one on the left here is a Plossl design. This is 4 elements in 2 groups. Plossl eyepieces today are basically your beginner workhorse eyepieces. We'll talk a little bit more about some of these. Where we have this in comparison to this one, which is a Nagler 2, which isn't made anymore. But this is an example of a much more complex eyepiece. And as you would imagine, this costs a lot more. So common eyepiece types. These first 2 are pretty much obsolete. And you're only going to find these in really low-end stuff. I bought a Celestron Travel Scope 50 from a sale. I got it for like $10. The whole thing. It retails for about $55. It had a Huygens and a Ramsden in it. I couldn't believe it. You'll see a marking of an H, such as H20. That's a Huygens type eyepiece. A Ramsden might say R or SR. These are 2-element eyepieces, and just by modern standards, they're obsolete. The 3-element eyepieces, Kellners, reverse Kellners, modified achromats. These are really low end by today's standards, but they're not bad necessarily. They're typically characterized by a fairly narrow apparent field of view, which is why I covered this earlier. You will get these in a lot of the beginner telescopes. And there are some Kellners that produce really, really sharp images. They're just not very wide. But I tell people who have purchased beginner scopes, unless you're really, really on an extremely tight budget, don't buy any more of these. There are much better eyepieces out there at very reasonable prices. Eyepieces that are common today, the Plossl is often included with the better beginner packages. They're available in 1.25 inch and 2 inch. These are what I would call the mainstream good quality eyepieces in an amateur astronomy market. They typically are well corrected. They produce pretty sharp images, even the very inexpensive ones. Eye relief can be quite short. If we remember back to that earlier slide where we looked at a 20mm eyepiece, a 15mm eyepiece, as Plossls get shorter, the eye relief gets shorter. So eye relief can become fairly restrictive below 12mm. I actually have a 6mm Plossl that has eye relief of about 5mm. And when I'm using it, I get really nice, sharp images, but my eye feels like it's right on the glass. But if you stay above a 12mm focal length eyepiece, Plossls are not bad. Typically only a 50-degree apparent field of view. One place where these do really work well and where I recommend them often is if you have a 1.25-inch focuser on your scope. The widest true field of view you can get in a 1.25-inch focuser is with a 32 or 40mm Plossl eyepiece. Now you can buy much more expensive eyepieces that have much more expensive capabilities, but a 32mm Plossl is pretty cheap, 30 to 40 bucks, and that's going to give you a very good image and the widest you can put in a 1.25-inch diagonal. So I have 5 scopes, 3 of them have 1.25-inch diagonals, and I use a 32mm Plossl as my low power wide view eyepiece. Files were developed during World War II. They were actually developed for bomb sites. And they were developed to have a wider field of view than what other eyepieces have. Typically, these are 60 degrees or wider. and they're typically low to medium power. They are prone to having visual edge aberrations. So if you're looking at the image of the sky, you'll see that the stars around the outer edge may not be as crisp and perfect as you would see in the center. For my 2-inch eyepieces, I have an file that is 38 millimeters, 70-degree apparent field of view. That's my low power wide view eyepiece in my 2-inch scopes. Yeah, the outer edge ain't perfect, but instead of spending $400 on an Explore Scientific 68-degree 40 millimeter, this was $100. And you know what? It's pretty good. So that's my low power wide view eyepiece. Now, common eyepiece types, Teleview brand has, their various product lines have almost become generic terms in the industry. I've seen so many discussions on cloudy nights, and I'm a big user of cloudy nights. If anybody goes out to cloudy nights, you see a guy out there, AEAJR, that's me. You get a beginner. I mean, guys just went to a store and he's got $100 70 millimeter telescope, and he's saying, what should I buy? And people are getting there. Well, what you really need is a 68-degree. What you need is a 30 millimeter panoptic. Now, if you guys have been around, a 30 millimeter panoptic is probably $250 to $300. Okay, and this guy doesn't know that. He's going, oh, okay, I have to go buy a panoptic because otherwise my children will never go to college. And but these terms are tossed around amongst the astronomy community, almost like they are like the terms of how to describe an eyepiece. So I felt it was important to include them here so that if somebody saw these, they would understand what they are. I personally don't have any Teleview eyepieces. I don't tend to be the high-end guy. I tend to be kind of more that mid-range kind of guy. Explore Scientific is more where I am. I love that effect. The zoom eyepiece. For those of you who have cameras, it is very likely that the lens on that camera today is a zoom lens. A single eyepiece that offers all the focal lengths within a range. For those of us who remember back into or if any of you are into high-end cameras and you're buying, DSLRs, or in the old days it was SLRs, where the lens comes off and you swap lenses. Typically they would come with a 50 millimeter lens, and you'd probably go buy a 70 and buy 100, and you'd spend a fortune. Or you were like me, and on my camera, I took the 50 millimeter off and I put a zoom lens on it. And that's the only lens I ever used. Even though I have a full set of Explore Scientific 82-degree eyepieces, my zoom eyepieces are what I use most of the time. So it's a single eyepiece that has multiple focal lengths within a range. If we see, this is an example of this is a Celestron zoom eyepiece, and this spans from 8 millimeters to 24 millimeters. I actually happen to own one of these. This was my first zoom. The great thing about it is you can go through a whole big magnification range, never change an eyepiece. Especially in when seeing is bad, these are terrific because you can move up a little bit, move down a little bit actively while the seeing is changing. The downside of a zoom eyepiece is the apparent field of view at the longer focal length is typically narrower than the shorter focal length. And most of these have been developed for spotting scopes. Nothing wrong with that. My workhorse zoom eyepieces in my smaller scopes, the 1.25s, are my Celestron. The Beta Hyperion 8-24 zoom is my most used eyepiece of all my eyepieces. It's about 50 degrees apparent field of view at 24 millimeter, and it goes to 68 degrees at 8 millimeters. And when I'm observing, typically I use my low power wide view, and then the zoom goes in. Anybody else here a Zoom user? I like to get a little feedback on this one. Anybody here use Zooms?
I
Yeah,
use
this is
that
Mike,
Celestra
but
and
I
Zoom.
am.
Yep.
I would say the Zoom is my favorite eyepiece for star parties and outreach events, because if you're changing targets rapidly, you can adjust it, on the fly, and you don't have to mess around with. And when you got a crowd of people standing by to look out your scope.
Yep. Yeah. So like I said, I use the Celestron in my smaller scopes just because it seems to fit better, feel better, and those smaller scopes, the Beta Hyperion, actually the body of it is a little wider, and it actually interferes with my getting to the screws to tighten it in place. So I use the Celestron. I also have one from SV Boni, which is a 7-21, $52. It's not bad. I like the Celestron better, but for $52, I had to give it a try. Specialty eyepieces. The one that I like to highlight is the reticle eyepiece. This presents a crosshair or a hatch or some other sort of division up of the viewing area. Now these can have many, many uses, but the best one that I can point out to people who are new is if you have a go-to scope or any other kind of go-to, push-to, where you're trying to do an alignment of the scope so that the scope will be then able to take you to your targets. A crosshair eyepiece is very, very useful because in order to do that alignment, it'll say, go to this star, now use your controls, get that star centered in your field of view. How accurately you center that will determine how accurate your go-to or push-to system is going to be for the rest of the night. So if you have a crosshair in there, and you can put that on whatever star you're aligning on, then you know that you're doing your best. The other place where I find these useful is for sketching. Now, let me clarify, I'm not an active sketcher, but when I do sketch, having a reticle eyepiece helps out because it helps me get a better feel for the relative positions of the stars and the DSO characters in the field of view. Yes, this one is here, and okay, it's just a little bit up to the left here. Okay, and so I can get a better feel for where this one is down here if I'm sketching it. Okay. So we're going to talk now about exit pupils. So an exit pupil is a characteristic of the light cone that comes out of the eyepiece. So if you know a little bit about the structure of your eye, you know you have a pupil, the black area inside of the iris. And depending on how well dark adapted your eye is, that pupil can get up to around 7 millimeters. And that's all the light you can get into your eye. Now, the purpose of a telescope and the eyepiece is to concentrate much larger amounts of light into a smaller cone so you can get it into your eye. As you go to shorter and shorter focal lengths of eyepieces, that light cone, that exit pupil, will get smaller and smaller. And so on the right-hand side here, I have a chart that says average human eye pupil diameter versus age. And night indicates what the pupil on your eye might be when it's fully dilated. And I will point out that this will vary by your local light pollution conditions. So when I'm fully adapted, if I'm out on the side of my house and my eyes are fully dark adapted, I don't get anywhere near this because I've got 3 LED lights out in front of my house, street lights. Plus my neighbors feel that they all need lights on around their house. My house is next to an industrial park, and of course that's all lit up like a shopping center. And so my fully adapted eye is probably more around this area. So when we look at the eyepieces and we're trying to optimize the brightness of the image in our eyes, typically more important with things like nebula than with stars, we pay attention to the exit pupil. So an exit pupil of 1 millimeter or less is often cited. Exit pupil is often cited as the optimum for detail. In other words, you got a 1 millimeter cone of light coming into your eye. It's illuminating enough of your retina and enough of the cones in the eye to get a very good and very detailed view. You go below 1 millimeter, people are suggesting that you're going to lose detail. I'm not so rigid on this, but this is just one of those little thumb, what do you call it, rule of thumb sort of benchmarks. If your exit pupil gets to be less than 0.5 millimeter, and you have floaters in your eyes, this is where these floaters start to interfere with the view, and I have this problem. So when I get to very high powers and I'm getting down to an exit pupil of less than 0.5 millimeter, I sometimes have to blink my eye, move my eye, shake my head to try and get a floater out of my way because I'm trying to see something and the floater is in the light path. If you look at, this is particularly true of reflectors. If you look at minimum effective magnification on that, like a Dob or any other Newtonian, that will typically be based upon a magnification specification that produces a 7 millimeter exit pupil. I thought that what would happen is, again, when I first started, I thought if I went below that number, my scope wouldn't work. And I later found out that no, this is to try to optimize the exit pupil on your eye. Let's move on. Now, I'm going to go back to this one. What happens if I have an exit pupil that's wider than my open pupil on my eye? What happens? You'll see a lot of conversations on cloudy nights about this. Oh, that eyepiece is no good for you because you're wasting all that light because the exit pupil is going to be wider than your pupil. So I went and did a lot of research on this. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. By the way, I will send this presentation out in PDF format after I'm done. So if there's anything here you want to read in more detail or study. But I was looking for more information about this whole exit pupil discussion because my low power wide view eyepiece produces an exit pupil in excess of 7 millimeters. And yet looks great to me. I don't seem to have a problem with it. Why is this such a big issue? So I went out and found an article by Al Nagler, from Teleview, who is considered, maybe a minor god within our hobby. And if Al Nagler says it's true, it's true. And you can go with it. So what I wanted to do was see, well, what did Al Nagler have to say about this? So he wrote an article. This is an excerpt from it. You can read through this while I'm talking to you. But I'm going to read through the second paragraph. The first paragraph is, are we wasting light? The truth is that while you're a wasting potential aperture, when the exit pupil exceeds your pupil, you're not wasting light because your eye is fully illuminated and you have the brightest possible image that you can ever have at that low magnification. And by the way, this large exit pupil issue only occurs at low magnification. Think of using 7x50 binoculars in the daytime when your exit pupil is only 3.5 millimeters. Now he's talking about the pupil of your eye. Your eye's pupil is only 3.5 millimeters. Does the image appear dimmer than it does in 7x25s? No. Of course not. Also, the resolution reduction, in other words, the resolution loss because we're losing some of that extra aperture effect. If a scope went down to 2-inch rather than 4-inch, it's totally invisible at that magnification. So if you're buying eyepieces and you do the calculation for your low power wide view eyepiece and you see that it produces an exit pupil of say 7 millimeters or larger, chances are your eye is not, your pupil is not open that wide. Doesn't really matter. This is my opinion. Okay. Now, I also mentioned that I have astigmatism. Some of you may have this as well. And so a lot of people will wear their glasses because they have astigmatism and their glasses correct for that. Well, it turns out that astigmatism is only really an issue at very large exit pupils. What this chart is showing is at what exit pupil. By the way, this Teleview makes a lens that you can attach to certain eyepieces, which will correct for astigmatism just like glasses. But do you really need it? So this is exit pupil on the side. This is your astigmatism diopters. If you wear glasses and your doctor writes you a prescription, he will give you an astigmatism diopter. Now the green one, that green dot, that's my astigmatism diopter. So what this tells me is that if the exit pupil on my eyepiece is greater than 3 millimeters, the astigmatism in my eye is going to show up. So I told you on my low power eye view eyepiece, stars can look spiky. If I look at Jupiter through that low power eye view, a wide view eyepiece, at like 30 power. Okay, so it doesn't look like a planet, it looks like a big flat star, but it's spiky, it's not round. If I put my glasses on, it's a round image. Why? Because the glass is correct for that astigmatism. But since I don't typically look at those types of targets at low power, and because I know it's my astigmatism, I don't wear my glasses. Once I get smaller than 3 millimeters, the astigmatism goes away and no longer affects the image that I'm seeing in the eyepiece. So if I wanted to, I could wear my eyeglasses until I got to a 3 millimeter exit pupil and then take them off. But typically I don't use them. But this can be useful for people who are looking through a telescope with their glasses, really would like to take them off. This gives you a feeling for where you can do that. Any questions? Nope. The Barlow lens. The Barlow lens is a wonderful device. Basically, it's a magnifying glass. And what it does is, and now we're talking, and by the way, you see Barlow will be capitalized because the name of the guy who developed this is Barlow. So it's his lens, so I capitalize it for his name, and that's typically the way we see it. Developed by Peter Barlow. It basically, what it does is it extends the focal length of your scope by diverging the light path as it's coming coming into the eyepiece. So it makes it look like the scope has a longer focal length. And as a result of having that longer effective focal length, that eyepiece will provide a higher magnification. So essentially, if you use your eyepiece in your scope, you get one magnification. If you put the Barlow lens in and put the eyepiece in, you get a different magnification. So each eyepiece now has 2 magnifications. So if you had 4 eyepieces before and you had 4 magnification options and you got yourself a 2x Barlow, you now have 8 magnifications. And so you've basically doubled your effectively doubled your eyepiece set for the low cost of a Barlow. Especially when working. Somebody had a question or comment? I'm hearing dings every now and then.
Oh, I
Hey, I did have a question if you don't mind.
No, please.
I keep hearing, or I've seen a number of the Teleview Power Mates, and they kind of talk to those like they're different from a Barlow somehow. Are they similar, or?
They are similar in effect. They're similar in use. They are actually referred to as telecentric. I'm not going to try to go into describing the difference between a Barlow lens and a telecentric lens, but essentially they treat the light differently. A Barlow lens, as a result of the way it works, can have an impact on the eye relief that is produced by an eyepiece, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Actually, in many cases, it's a good thing. A telecentric lens doesn't do that. There are other characteristics about telecentric lenses that are different, but for the purposes of this discussion, they do exactly the same thing. If this was a TeleVue telecentric lens in here, a PowerMate, and it was a 2x, it would double the magnification produced by this eyepiece. From what I read, the telecentric method is actually better. But from a practical point of view, unless you want to pay a high price, the typical Barlow lens is quite effective. And modern Barlow lenses tend not to introduce any significant aberrations until you get down to, let's call it the low end, really garbagey ones. Okay, so I haven't really answered your question. Other than to say for the purposes of this discussion, they would be used for the same purposes.
Right, thank
Okay.
you.
I could throw a lot of bull on there, but I'm not going to.
They're worth a couple $100.
Yeah. Well, let's take a look at that. Let's address that. As is the case with most of the technology that you buy, whether it's telescopes and eyepieces, whether it's computers, whether it's cars, you can get a really good operating thing for a relatively low price. The computer that I'm using now, the one that my wife has, these are used for email and for browsing, and I use it for word processing. I don't really do anything heavy duty on this computer. But if I was a high-speed gamer or doing video editing, or I was doing high-end graphics, this computer could never keep up. The difference in cost between this one, which would be say a few $100s, to that one, which might be a few $1,000s. Okay, but the point is, do I really need that? If I had that high-end computer, would my word processing, network browsing, and email be any better? And the answer is no. So when we're talking about eyepieces, when we're talking about Barlow lenses, and we're talking about, hey, I can buy a 2x Barlow for $20, or I can buy a 2x, TeleVue, and it's $150. Well, if I put the two of them next to each other in the eyepiece, the question is, would you notice the difference? Well, the average beginner probably no. Someone who's been doing this for years, who has a real keen eye, would go, oh my God, how could you not see the difference? All right. And for some of us, we want the very, very best we can get, and we're willing to pay for it. But for each, that lower end item is probably 80 to 90% as good as the high end item at a tenth the price. So this is a cost benefit analysis on every occasion. Is it worth it to get that extra bit of value? Are my Explore Scientific eyepieces as good as the TeleVues? From what I read, they're really close. Okay, and this is not a commercial for Explore Scientific or TeleVue. I'm just trying to give you a comparison. But when I bought them, the Explore Scientifics were half the price.
Hey, Ed,
Yeah?
Ed, we have a question out here at the Nature Center.
Sure.
Go ahead, read it.
What effect does a Barlow lens have on the field of view? I have a Daystar Quark, and then I noticed that since a Barlow is like 4.2 times, the field of view goes way down. So is that like for just my Quark, or is it for like all Barlows that affect the field?
So we need to make a distinction between apparent field of view and field of view. The apparent field of view is a characteristic of the eyepiece. And the apparent field of view of the eyepiece does not change with the use of a Barlow. Now, let me get through the whole way and you'll see the final result. However, magnification does cause a change in field of true field of view, of actual field of view. So if I take an eyepiece and it, say I take a 20 millimeter Plössl eyepiece, it has a 50-degree apparent field of view. And I do the calculation on your telescope, we'll discover that the field of view is whatever it is. Let's say it's half a degree. If I use a 10 millimeter Plössl, same type of eyepiece, same apparent field of view, I'll get twice the magnification and half the field of view because I increase the magnification. This is true for all eyepieces of all types, of all brands, and all apparent field of views. You increase magnification, field of view goes down. All right. The Barlow does not change this. If you were to take the 20 millimeter, put it in a 2X Barlow, it would work like a 10 millimeter, and it would give you the same field of view as a 10 millimeter eyepiece. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
he's good.
that question comes up very often. And so, but it's important to understand that the effect is not a result of the Barlow or a result of the eyepiece. It's a result of magnification. All right. So a Barlow can be an integral part of your eyepiece plan. And I focus in on this for the moment because I'm buying my first eyepieces. I got 2 eyepieces with my scope, and now I want to fill them out. And the 2 eyepieces I got with the scope are not very good, so I'm not really going to plan to use those long term. So what eyepieces should I buy? So I might tell you, buy a 32 millimeter, buy a 16 millimeter, buy an 8 millimeter. But if you're going to put a 2X Barlow in the group, well, that 32 millimeter in the 2X Barlow is a 16. So while you're still building out, I would tell you, don't buy the 16, buy a 12. Okay, buy the 8, Barlow the 12, you got a 6. So what happens is we use the Barlow to fill in the gaps. And we pick our eyepieces so that when we use the Barlow, there's a gap to fill. I don't have another eyepiece there. There's no point buying a 16 millimeter eyepiece if you can Barlow the 32 and you could use your limited dollars to go buy a 12. Now, eventually over time, you'll probably fill out your eyepiece set as I have. Do we throw the Barlow away? No. Where the Barlow comes in handy is we look at what's the highest magnification that you're likely to use on your telescope at any given time. And there's a whole bunch of factors that affect that, and I'm not going to go into that. However, you may find that, yes, I can get to 200 power on a pretty regular basis. So I'm going to buy an actual eyepiece to do the 200 power because I'm more comfortable with that. But what if I want to try to see if I can get to 400 power? Am I going to buy an eyepiece to do that? No, drop that one into a 2X Barlow. The Barlow is cheap. You already had it because you were using it in the earlier part of your eyepiece acquisition. So continue to use it, and that's how my Barlows live now. I have a 1.5, a 2, a 2.5, and depending on which telescope I'm using, if the night is extremely clear and I think I can push up beyond the normal range of what I can see, I'll drop one of those Barlows in and use one of my eyepieces to go push beyond my usual top magnification. The other value of the Barlow is that if you're using something, and many eyepieces, I don't know if I can say most, but many eyepieces, as you go shorter in the eyepiece, shorter in the focal length of the eyepiece, the eye relief gets short. And so what you can do is use the Barlow, instead of buying an 8 millimeter Plössl eyepiece, which is going to have very short eye relief, you buy a 16 and use it in a 2X Barlow, and the eye relief stays the same as what it is for the 16. Doesn't change. This is especially useful for people who wear glasses. All right, who couldn't even use that 8 millimeter Barlow, 8 millimeter Plössl eyepiece because the eye relief's too short. Okay, but that 16 might have enough eye relief for them. Put it in the 2X Barlow. Now they have the equivalent of an 8 and they have the eye relief they need for the 16. So these are tools. You know, do you use a socket wrench? Do you use an open end wrench? Do you use a box wrench? Well, you use the tool that's right for the task, and you pick the right task for the tool. I just bought my first telescope. What eyepiece should I buy? My essential recommendations to people are what you want is 1 or 2 low power wide view eyepieces for each scope. Now that doesn't mean if you have 3 scopes, you need 6 eyepieces. It means that you need an eyepiece that will give you 1 or 2 that will give you low power wide view on that. My personal practice is I have an eyepiece that will maximize the field of view of every one of my telescopes. Remember, we went back and we said, if we take the apparent field of view of the eyepiece and divide it by the magnification, we'll get the true field of view. I have an eyepiece for each of my telescopes that will maximize that true field of view. All right. The reason I do that is if you're star hopping, this allows you to see more of the sky as you're doing your star hopping. Or if you're looking at larger objects, that maximized field of view allows you to get larger objects into the field of view, or more of an object. One eyepiece that matches your focal ratio for your initial highest power eyepiece. So if you have an f5 scope, that's a 5mm eyepiece, or it might be a 10mm plus 2x Barlow. Just as an example. By the way, Barlows you can get Barlows anywhere from 1.5 to 5. I think I had it on the slide earlier, but I didn't mention it. For visual observing, typically we use the 1.5 to 3x range on the Barlows. Typically more than that is used for astrophotography. No reason why you can't put an eyepiece into a 4x, 5x Barlow, but the magnifications become, typically, it would be too much magnification to be used. That's a whole other discussion about that we can get into. Fill in between these according to your plan to use a Barlow or not. So as I said, if you've got the money, buy the 32, buy the 16, buy the 8. If you're tight on budget and you're trying to build over time, buy the 32 plus a 2x Barlow, get a 12, because you can always use that 2x Barlow to make it a 6. Planning to use a Barlow can save money, especially for very high power. Now, the alternative plan is 1 or 2 low power wide view eyepieces, and then a zoom eyepiece. And in most cases, is again, a Barlow. This is what I usually recommend to new people who, especially those on a budget. An example. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples on building an eyepiece set. 1200mm focal length scope. This is your typical 6-inch, 8-inch, 10-inch Newtonian Dob. Could be a refractor. It includes a 25 and a 10mm Plössl eyepiece. All right. So that 25mm is going to give you 48x. The 10mm is going to give you 120x. Now I add a 2x Barlow. So I can take that 10mm, put it in the Barlow, and now I have the equivalent of a 5mm. I've got 240x. Quick, inexpensive addition to expand magnifications. The 25mm is a 12.5, 96. So now I have 48, 96, 120, and 240 just by adding the Barlow. And every eyepiece I add from this point forward will have 2 magnifications. Now, in this case, I'm looking at a 1200mm focal length, typical 6-inch, 8-inch, 10-inch Newtonian that has a 2-inch focuser. So now that I've got, let's call this medium to high power, I've put in this 38mm. This is the example I'm using here has a 70-degree apparent field of view. Gives me 31.5x and 2.2 degree field of view in that scope That's as wide as you can go. So now I've got low power, widest I can go, medium and high powers. Over time, I may replace this 25 with something better quality. Still have 2 magnifications. I might replace this one with better quality or maybe more eye relief. And so I fill them in. Here's a case where we now have all single focal length eyepieces where we have filled into the up to the 8mm with actual eyepieces. We're still using the Barlow to get those high powers. Everybody, in my opinion, should have a Barlow lens, and 2x is the most common. At some point, I decide, you know, I'm going to add a 6mm because I can also double it for 3mm. Now, in my 8-inch job, typically I couldn't get over 200 on most nights, say on planets, you know, certain deep sky objects. So everything up here I did with the Barlow, simply because it just wasn't cost justified for me to go buy an eyepiece in these ranges. Now that I have a 12-inch job and I can hit these magnifications more often, I added a 4.5mm eyepiece, but I still have the Barlows to push that higher too. Going to do this again, but we're going to do it based on a zoom. So again, we have those first 2 eyepieces. Again, we want to throw in a that 38mm to maximize the low end. And if I include a 2x Barlow initially, I've doubled these 2. But my expectation that this 25 and this 10 that came with the scope are not great quality, and I'm probably going to end up replacing them. I pop in a 24-8 zoom, and I've got 50 to 150 power and every magnification in between 150 and 150 power. And I don't have to swap eyepieces to move from one to the other. Now I take that zoom and I drop it into a 2x Barlow. I now have 100 to 300x. So I get a newbie who comes to me and says, I just bought a 6-inch Dob. The focal length's 1200mm. What should I buy? Okay, you got a lot of money? Go out and buy that whole set of Teleview Naglers. You're on a tight budget. Pick yourself up this eyepiece, about $100, the one I show them. Get yourself a 24-8 zoom and get yourself a 2x Barlow. And with 1, 2 plus the Barlow, you have the entire magnification range of the scope for most nights. How much does it cost to do that? Let's see, my SV Bony zoom is $55, I think it was. Is it the best? No, but it's pretty good. My Celestron today sells for about 90, and my Beta Hyperion, which is my favorite, is about 300. So how much money do you got to spend? Are you buying to get started, or are you buying your final products? Okay, but they all scale the same way. Factors not addressed in the examples, you know, how much do you want to spend? Over what time and period do you want to spend? The eyepiece set that I have today, I built over 4 to 5 years. Looking at apparent field of view, how well corrected are they? Cheap eyepieces tend to be poorly corrected. How fussy are you about the edge? You know, I give you an eyepiece, you put it in your scope and you go, wow. And I give you that eyepiece to somebody else and he goes, this is a piece of crap. Okay, how fussy are you about the edge? Almost everything is clean in the center. What's the focal ratio of your scope? It'll tell me more about how likely you are to have poor correction at the edges with cheap eyepieces. And how do you feel about zooms? Okay, zoom eyepieces can almost become a religious battle. I get into a discussion on cloudy nights all the time, and I recommend to zoom to somebody, and there's going to be someone who's going to come in and say, if you're using a zoom eyepiece, you'll end up quitting the hobby because you will hate it. And meanwhile, to me, it's my favorite eyepiece. Now, here's my eyepiece set for when I had my Orion XT8i. I have since added to this. So this was an Agena Astro. This is still my low power wide view. 70 millimeter, costs about $100. 70 degree apparent field of view, 38 millimeter. And I put this here so you can see its scale. So I've got a 38, a 20, 8.8, 6.7, 5.5. That was as far as I went with standard eyepieces. If I had an exceptionally good night and I wanted to push beyond that, I would take the 8.8 and put it in the Barlow, and I had 272. Gee, can I get better than that? Maybe I'm up on the moon and the sky and the atmosphere is really calm. I'll put the 6.7 into the 2X Barlow. Okay. Do I really want to push it at like to the limits? Let's try the 5.5 in the 2X Barlow and see how it looks. All right. These three were magnifications that I could not typically hit on a given night. So rather than spend money for eyepieces that I was rarely ever going to use, I just let the Barlow do the work for me. Notice I'm not filling gaps with it anymore. I did in the beginning, but I'm not now. Whoops, going back. Now, as I was in the process of building these, I ended up buying a Celestron zoom and then later a Beta Hyperion zoom. And that Beta Hyperion gave me 50 to 150 with no gaps. I love that. And if I dropped it in the 2X Barlow, 100 to 300. But what I discovered was that 2X Barlow that I had, I could remove the Barlow element off the end of the Barlow and screw it right onto the zoom. And when I did that, I got a 1.5 magnification. And what it did is it shifted that Barlow from 50 to 150 to 75 to 225, which for my 8-inch Dob on 90% of the nights, that was absolutely the perfect range. And if you remember, I said back when we talked about zooms, that zooms go from a narrower field of view at the low power to a wider field of view at the high power. Well, typically, while I could come down to 24 millimeters, and I use it that way. I typically use it more probably in about 110 to 225 in the wider part of the zoom's apparent field of view range. So this just perfectly matched that zoom to my scope. Most nights, I would pop this in, maybe this one. I go to this and stay there all night. If I was changing targets and I couldn't swing over and find it immediately, I'd go back to one of these, find the target, and if it was something that wanted magnification, I go right back to the zoom. I now have ES82s. I've got the 14, the 11, 8.8, 6.7. I got the Meade 5.5 and the ES82 4.7. Most nights they stay in the case. Okay. And this is what I pull out. Some eyepieces are waterproof. How important is that? Well, it's certainly not required. Okay, typically we're out observing. We're not out observing in the rain. We're not out observing in the snow. However, we are out sometimes out observing when it gets very dewy. And so waterproof might be nice, but most eyepieces, even if they're not waterproof, unless you get them really, really wet, you're not going to get water inside. Waterproof doesn't affect the optical quality. It does exclude moisture intrusion into the optics. It will, as a result, prevent any internal fogging or mold that might result from getting water in the eyepiece. It's a consideration if you plan to view under heavy dew conditions. I personally don't. I don't like sitting at the eyepiece feeling wet and having water running off the tube of my telescope. I mean, that's just my thing.
I'm laughing at most of the people on here are Michigan, so it well applies to them.
Yep. So to me, waterproof is a nice to have, but I wouldn't make it a decision factor in most cases. If I had two eyepieces were about the same price and they both seem to be winners, okay, get the one that's waterproof. But other than that, I don't think it's a deep need. So the whole purpose of going through this presentation tonight was to try to demystify eyepieces, the language around eyepieces, and why different eyepieces produce different results. So we talked about the size, 1.25 inches, 2 inch. We talk about focal length and magnification, eye relief, common eyepiece types, apparent field of view, coatings, fixed versus zoom, waterproof versus not, and the role of the Barlow lens in the eyepiece collection. That's all I have on the presentation. I'd be very happy to open this to discussion. And if someone disagrees with me on any of this, bring it on. I always enjoy a good debate. So thank you very much for giving up your evening to listen to me. I hope you found this helpful.
Great, Ed. Thank you very much for that fantastic presentation. If you'd like to ask a question and you're on Zoom, please remember to unmute yourself because I think we all muted. And at the Nature Center, you may have to walk up to the laptop. So with that, fire away.
By the way, I've got as much time as you guys want. So.
Okay, great.
So I have a question. Can you hear me, Ed?
I hear you just fine.
So if you have a quark, it has a built-in telecentric Barlow essentially. So
you're talking about, let me make sure I understand what you're talking about, something that's used for observing the sun.
That's right.
That's what I was talking about as well.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm sure there might be 1 or 2 people on the phone who don't know what a quark is. That's why I was asking.
Yes.
What you just did was said, yes, newbie, you should buy Naglers.
Well, that's actually my point to ask. Specifically, they say it doesn't work well with Naglers, and they actually recommend Plossels, but I never really understood why. And I don't know if it has something to do with the built-in telecentric thing. They say, you know what works best with these is a standard TeleVue Plossel or even lower end Plossels, but we recommend TeleVue because it's fine quality.
I use a Panoptic and it worked really fine, but then I got to have a high-end refractor. So
okay.
So I'm sorry. Go ahead. I cut you off.
I'm not sure if you have experience with that, or if there's some sort of technical reason, or if it's just that's what they tend to recommend. I don't know. So
I'm going to guess. I'm not an avid solar observer, and I don't have a quark. But based upon what you said, just listening to what you're telling me and running in my head here, okay, so why would I tell somebody that if he uses this optical device in his light path, that he's better off with Plossels than he is with wide field, Naglers and such? And my expectation is that the light cone coming out of the quark will not fully illuminate an 82-degree eyepiece.
okay.
And so while it likely will work, you're wasting capability, because that eyepiece has the ability to see a much wider view than the quark is presenting to it. Now, again, someone said here that they're using a Panoptic, which I think is a 68-degree eyepiece, as opposed to a Plossel, which is a 50. And you're saying it's worked fine. Now, let me ask, are you getting any vignetting, any cutting off of the image around the edges?
no, but then again, I have a very, very high-end refractor, so that might be a part of it too.
Yeah, it may simply be a case of don't go spending $400 on an eyepiece when a $50 eyepiece will give you just as good a view.
I actually have a Hunt solar scope, and when I bought it, the guy sold me 7 to 21 zooms.
Okay.
So I don't know what optical formula those are, or how similar they are to your SB Boney one, but hey, 7 to 21 zoom, it sounds similar, but not, it's not an
So just a little side note on eyepieces, and we'll address that. There are lots and lots of brands of eyepieces out on the market. Celestron and Orion and Meade and all like that. And a lot of them look real similar to each other because they're actually exactly the same eyepiece with a different label on them. And if you're in the hobby for a while, you see this, and there are only really a few manufacturers that are actually producing these. Yet there's probably 50 brands out there. So the possibility is that you may have gotten, and I'm going to make this up now, he sold you a Johnson Superpower Zoom 7-21, and I bought an SV Boney 70-21, and Johnson Superpower didn't make it, and SV Boney didn't make it. Barsta made it, and they both buy it from Barsta and put their label on it.
Actually, it's a Lunt branded.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Someone said it was similar to a Barsta.
Yep. So it may actually be a Barsta.
Yeah.
So after you're in the hobby for a while, you tend to figure out, or if you're out on cloudy nights, which is just a wonderful source of information. I can't say enough good things about the Cloudy Nights forum. Anybody who's on this call rather, who doesn't use Cloudy Nights, the astronomy forum, you're missing out on something fantastic. Probably 70% of what I learned about astronomy, learned about equipment, learned about how to observe, learned how to overcome, I learned on Cloudy Nights. Anyway, getting back to that. So yeah, it's very likely that is made by somebody else. Now, it might not be the SV Boney. SV Boney may be getting theirs from somebody else. SV Boney has a whole line of optical products, but I don't think they make any of them. So, and like, for example, your base Plossels sold by the big brand names, most of them are GSO. GSO is a Taiwan manufacturer of eyepieces. For example, my Agena Astro 38 millimeter 70 degree apparent field of view eyepiece, the 2-inch that I use as my low power wide view, is absolutely identical to an Orion Q70. It is exactly the same eyepiece. And so, you buy either one, you're okay. So as long as you're happy with the eyepiece you have, and it's working well for you and you're not getting a lot of bad distortion around the edges, that's great. Works well for you, use it. One of the nice things about being part of a club, and for anybody on this call who is not part of a club, who is, learning about astronomy, do yourself a favor and join a club. Because one of the wonderful things that happens about clubs is people are pretty generous about sharing what they know. And even more important, hey, I was thinking about buying that eyepiece. Would you mind if I try it in my scope? I mean, we have, club observing sessions. We swap an eyepieces around all the time. I mean, it's a lot of fun. So, that's a very good reason to be part of a club. Did I answer your question?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, I see Kelly raising his hand.
Hey, I just had trouble with muting. Sorry about the cat playing the piano.
That's all right.
She'll be
I
done
have
in a
cats
second.
too. We
There
have
we go.
cats too.
I was wondering if you follow the market, and if you do, like, what would you consider some bargain buys for like low, medium, and high range, maybe?
Sure.
Or something. Or do you have any opinions like that?
Well, I'm full of opinions. Ask my wife. But based upon what I've used personally, what I read on Cloudy Nights, what I hear from other members of my club, and what I recommend to people on the forums, because that's what I base my recommendations on. If you're working on a fairly tight budget and you're trying to build out an eyepiece set, as I showed in my example, a zoom eyepiece and a Barlow that's appropriate to the focal length of your scope. Sometimes I recommend a 2x Barlow, sometimes I recommend a 3x Barlow. Usually what I refer to as these 1.5/2x Barlows, where you can remove the element. I see a confusion on your face, so I'll give you an example. GSO makes a 2X Barlow. That is, if you buy an Orion Shorty Barlow, 2X Shorty Barlow, that's a GSO Barlow. And you can unscrew the Barlow element off the bottom. Well, I don't know if that's the same one. I'd have to pull it out. Let me see it. If you unscrew the Barlow element off the bottom, okay, that does not look like the bottom element comes off. Okay, I don't have mine here. I would show it to you. Anyway, and you can screw it onto the bottom of any eyepiece and it works like a 1.5 power Barlow. Now, I don't typically recommend doing that on individual eyepieces, but it's a great thing to do on a zoom. Okay, because an 8 to 24 now becomes a 16 to 5.6. And in fact, that's what I used in my 8-inch stop. But anyway, good value eyepieces. So astronomics.com, who is the host of Cloudy Nights, has a line of eyepieces called the Paradigm. These have an apparent field of view of 60 degrees, and they get nothing but terrific reviews. And probably the greatest compliment I've heard paid to these is this: these are not just good for the price, these are just good eyepieces. Apparent field, they cost about $60 to $65 each. Agena Astro sells exactly the same eyepiece. They call it their Star Guider. All right. So those are highly recommended. I happen to be, we'll make a jump here again. We're going to use Astronomics again because these are the ones that I'm seeing that are the hot ones lately. Astronomics also has a line of eyepieces. They're called their super wide angle. These are 82-degree eyepieces. Now, my 82-degree eyepiece, Explore Scientifics, cost about $200 a piece. These are $99 a piece in the 1 1/4. And the reviews, and I don't have one, the reviews I'm reading about them are just terrific. People who have TeleViews, people who have Explore Scientific, people who have all the other are saying these are incredibly good eyepieces for the price. And so they're getting recommended all the time. They have one 2-inch in the line for those who have 2-inch focusers. It's a 28 millimeter, 82 degrees. It's about $200. Well, a comparable eyepiece in the Explore Scientific line is $400. So these are highly recommended. I happen to really be a big fan of the Explore Scientific 82-degree line, ES82s. And I constantly see these being compared to the TeleViews. And so this is one of those things where the two cars cross the line. Yes, the TeleView wins, but by a foot. So if you have to be in the #1 car, you get the TeleView. If you don't quite have to be there and you want to save some money, you get the ES82s. Then TeleView. TeleView is the only thing you can say about TeleView is nobody was ever sorry they bought the very best. And in the hobby market, TeleView is pretty much the very best. Now, you'll get people who will argue about Pentax and others, but if you want to go for a well-known, well-respected, reliable brand with tremendous support, you go to TeleView. In zooms. So there are zooms out there that cost $1,000. There are zooms out there that cost $30. The three I have, of the three I have, the one that I like best is the Beta Hyperion zoom. It's about $300. And when I use it and compare it to the eyepieces that I own, which are primarily Explore Scientific 82s, other than the field of view being a little bit smaller, I feel I lose nothing. I don't lose sharpness. I don't lose image quality. I don't lose anything when I switch back and forth between the zoom and the ES82s. And so that has become my workhorse 1.25" eyepiece. Celestron has a very good one, which I also own. That was my first zoom. And I put it in comparison, and I have compared it closely to my Plössl eyepieces. And Plössls are very good eyepieces. They just have very short eye relief as you get down below 12 millimeters, and they have a relatively narrow field of view. And the Celestron zoom runs from 40 degrees AFOV to 60, where the Baader Hyperion runs from 50 to 68. And I think it's better corrected. So if you've got a relatively low focal length scope, I think the Baader does better in those. And then I have the SV Bony 7-21. It was like $55. It runs from 38 degrees to 56 degrees apparent field of view, so it's narrower than the others. I don't think it's quite as well corrected as the Celestron, but it's lightweight, it's cheap, it works really well. I use it as a loaner eyepiece. I have one scope dedicated to a loaner. It's a tabletop Dob, 100 millimeter. And all I ever do with it is loan it to people. And I loan it to, and I include a 32 millimeter Plössl, and I include the zoom, and I include a 2X Barlow. And that allows them to, get a feel for telescopes and enjoy the sky. We could go on for hours on this, but just to give you, and I'm trying to give you things that are in series. You can cherry pick all over the market. But those are series that I would be very comfortable recommending to any friend. So I hope, Kelly, that answered your question. Any other questions?
I wanted to jump in since you mentioned cloudy nights. I heard they have a really, really good market for used eyepieces that people are selling as they're upgrading on there that you can get good deals on. Another good reason to join cloudy nights.
It is highly, it has a very good reputation, but like anything that you buy online, Cloudy Nights doesn't do anything to vet who's selling or whether or not they're legitimate people. So, but from what I read, the quality of the people who sell on Cloudy Nights are very good, and people seem to be very happy with it. But Cloudy Nights doesn't do anything to check or guarantee any of that. I'm not a person who typically buys and sells this stuff. I buy it and I keep it, or more often I sell it locally, possibly to a member of the club. When I sold my 8-inch Dob, I included some eyepieces with it, and I taught the guy how to use it. So, but I don't typically go out to the market to buy and sell in that way. Although I did buy my Baader Hyperion zoom I bought off eBay, used, and got a very good arrangement on that. So the reputation for the market is good, but Cloudy Nights doesn't do anything to vet it.
But Ed, you do get to see ratings that people receive from buyers.
Yep.
So at least there's that.
Yeah, well, that's assuming you've got repeat buyers and they're around a long time. You can always get the hack who comes in one time, tells you he's got the scope for $4,000. You send him the $4,000 and you never get the scope.
Yeah, that's true.
And you don't think you're going to go to Cloudy Nights for some sort of help, because they're just not going to do that.
Yep. So it's buyer beware.
But
I've had good luck there.
Yeah, I mean, I've bought used equipment, but I've always bought it, except for that zoom eyepiece, I've always bought it locally. Off Craigslist or from a club member, where I could actually go see, touch, feel. When I paid my money, I walked away with the product. Anybody else? The topic? I'm more than happy to talk about something other than eyepieces, but obviously that's the topic of the discussion. If somebody has a question about what's a good first telescope to buy or something like that, I have opinions on pretty much everything.
Anyone at all?
Good job, Ed. Appreciate that.
Yeah, well, while we're waiting, or if we're finished with questions, I will put in a plug. If you're looking at a first telescope, or if someone has asked you for advice or help on a first telescope, I strongly, strongly recommend the Celestron StarSense Explorer series. And for those who don't know what this is, these are Celestron telescopes, but they have now come up with a solution that uses your smartphone. You attach it to a frame on the scope. It turns the camera on and photographs the sky and uses what's referred to as plate solving to determine where it's pointed. And it's a push-to system. It's self-aligning, and the reports on it are just terrific. There are a lot of people on cloudy nights who have done unbelievable number of posts saying, I bought the lowest priced one I could find. I took the frame off it and the license for the software, and I attached it to my 25-inch Dob, and that's how I'm finding things in the sky now. The reviews on this platform are just fantastic. The lowest end two are 80 millimeter refractor and 114 millimeter reflector. Don't buy the 114 reflector. It's a Burr-Jones design. And if you know anything about reflector telescopes, the Burr-Jones design just has a terrible reputation. So all the rest of the series are good. They have everything from that 80 millimeter reflector up to a 10-inch Dob. So I just wanted to put one in for that. Any other questions?
No, we're good here at the Nature Center.
All right, very good.
Okay, great. Thank you again, Ed, for that wonderful presentation. It's very informative and entertaining.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, for inviting me, and my apologies to everyone again for being late.
And same here for not sending Ed the link.
Well, again, it was a test. I knew it was a test. Can he figure out how to get in without us telling him where the keys are?
Yeah, and you did too. So.